ARMY, what if the most emotional moment involving Jimin and Jungkook during a busy tour had nothing to do with the stage, choreography, or thousands of screaming fans? Imagine the concert lights fading, the music finally becoming silent, and the two members stepping into a quiet room after hours of performing. They are exhausted, their energy almost completely drained, and all they want is a few peaceful moments to breathe. Then, unexpectedly, the door opens and someone walks in carrying several containers of freshly prepared food from Busan. According to the story circulating among fans, that person was Jimin's father. But what makes this story so touching is not simply that he brought food. It is the possibility that after a long and exhausting day, Jimin and Jungkook were reminded of something that fame, luxury, and a massive concert could never replace: the warmth of home. And there is one detail that makes the story even more intriguing. What exactly was inside those containers that reportedly made the moment so meaningful? According to the narrative, the atmosphere changed completely once the doors to the waiting room closed. Just moments earlier, Jimin and Jungkook had been surrounded by bright stage lights, loud music, staff members, and the incredible energy of thousands of ARMYs. But behind the scenes, everything suddenly became quiet. After spending hours preparing, rehearsing, traveling, and performing, the two were reportedly sitting on a sofa, taking a moment to recover. Their public personas disappeared into the background, leaving only two exhausted young men who needed rest after another demanding day. It was during this quiet moment, according to the story, that something unexpected happened. A middle-aged man entered the room carrying neatly arranged food containers, immediately changing the atmosphere from exhaustion to warmth. The man was said to be Jimin's father, and what he reportedly brought with him was not an expensive meal from a luxury restaurant, but something far more personal: food prepared with the feeling of home. The story says that Jimin's father had prepared the food himself and brought it from Busan as a surprise for Jimin and Jungkook. Whether every detail of the story is accurate or not, the emotional idea behind the moment is easy to understand. For someone constantly moving from one city to another, spending long hours on planes, rehearsing late into the night, and performing in front of enormous crowds, a homemade meal can carry a completely different meaning. It is not about price or presentation. It is about knowing that someone took the time to think about you. The narrative even claims that the preparation began early in the morning, with several hours supposedly spent preparing different dishes before carefully packing everything for the journey. If that detail is true, then the food represented much more than dinner. It represented time, effort, patience, and a father's desire to make sure his son had something comforting to eat during an exhausting period of his life. When the containers were reportedly opened, the atmosphere inside the room changed again. The smell of warm, home-cooked food filled the space, creating a feeling completely different from the environment surrounding a major concert. Jimin, who had reportedly looked tired only moments earlier, seemed to become more attentive as he realized what had arrived. There is something uniquely powerful about the smell of food connected to childhood and family. A familiar dish can bring back memories without requiring a single explanation. For Jimin, the aroma of a meal prepared by his father could represent memories of Busan, family gatherings, ordinary days before his life became dominated by stages and schedules, and the comfort of knowing that someone close to him was still looking after him. That is why, if this moment truly happened as described, the most emotional part may not have been the food itself, but Jimin's reaction to realizing that someone from home had gone out of their way to bring him comfort. The story becomes even more meaningful when Jungkook enters the picture. According to the narrative, Jimin's father did not simply prepare food for his son and leave. He also made sure Jungkook could enjoy the meal with them. That small gesture is what gives the story its warmest feeling. Jungkook is, of course, accustomed to enormous stages, international attention, and fans welcoming him wherever BTS performs. Yet in this imagined quiet setting, there was no performance to give and no audience to impress. He could simply sit down, accept the food respectfully, and enjoy a meal alongside Jimin and his father. If the story is accurate, that simple interaction would show a completely different side of the relationship between them, not one defined by choreography or stage moments, but by ordinary human kindness and the comfort of sharing food together after a difficult day. This is why fans might describe such a meal as a bite of love from Busan. The phrase is not really about the food itself. It is about what the food represents. Every container would carry a message that does not need to be spoken aloud. Someone at home was thinking about them. In the middle of a demanding tour, when schedules can become overwhelming and personal time becomes limited, a homemade meal can feel incredibly precious. Jimin and Jungkook may be global superstars when they walk onto a stage, but behind that image are people who still become tired, still need to eat, and still appreciate being cared for. The contrast is what makes the story so compelling. Thousands of people may be cheering for them from outside the room, but inside that small space, the most important thing may simply have been having a warm meal and someone familiar nearby. One of the most intriguing details in the circulating story is the claim that the food may have taken around 8 hours to prepare. This should be treated as part of the story rather than confirmed fact, but if it were true, it would make the gesture even more remarkable. 8 hours is not simply the time required to cook a meal. It could represent shopping for ingredients, preparing vegetables, seasoning meat, making soup, cooking rice, preparing side dishes, tasting the food, and finally packing everything carefully enough to survive the journey. A meal prepared over that amount of time would demonstrate an extraordinary level of effort. And perhaps that is why the exact dish becomes such an interesting question. Was there one particular food that Jimin immediately recognized? Was it something he had grown up eating? Or was it a collection of familiar Korean dishes designed to recreate the feeling of sitting at his family's table? This is where the mystery becomes even more fascinating. If the story is true, what kind of food could have been prepared for such a special occasion? Perhaps there was warm soup, rice, meat, vegetables, or traditional Korean side dishes. Perhaps there was a specific family recipe that carried a deeper meaning for Jimin. It could even have been a dish that reminded him of ordinary days in Busan, long before he became an internationally recognized artist. The exact menu is unknown from the story provided, and it would be misleading to claim a specific dish without reliable evidence. But that uncertainty actually makes the narrative more interesting, because sometimes the identity of the food is less important than the reaction it creates. If Jimin recognized the aroma immediately and smiled after seeing the containers, then the dish had already accomplished something more important than simply satisfying hunger. It had brought a small piece of home into an otherwise exhausting world. Jungkook's presence would also make the scene especially meaningful for fans. According to the story, Jimin's father made sure that Jungkook was included in the meal rather than treating him simply as someone accompanying his son. That small gesture could easily make the atmosphere feel like a family gathering. Jungkook, who normally appears confident and energetic on stage, would instead be sitting quietly and enjoying a homemade meal after a long day. If he expressed gratitude or complimented the food, it would add another layer to the story. But there is no need to imagine an exaggerated reaction. Sometimes the most touching moments are the simplest ones. Accepting a plate, saying thank you, smiling, and continuing to eat while having a quiet conversation. That ordinary behavior would be enough to show how different life can feel when the cameras are gone and people are simply allowed to be themselves. For ARMY, perhaps the most touching part of the story would be seeing Jimin away from the glamorous environment normally associated with him. Fans usually see him beneath massive spotlights, wearing carefully designed stage outfits, performing complicated choreography, and giving everything he has to the audience. But a private meal represents something completely different. It reminds people that behind the artist is someone with a family, memories, favorite foods, and a place he considers home. If the story is accurate, the presence of his father during such an exhausting period could have offered a kind of emotional comfort that no concert venue could provide. And perhaps that is why the image of Jimin sitting beside his father, eating food prepared from home, feels so much more intimate and meaningful than another spectacular stage moment. A demanding world tour can create a strange contrast in an artist's life. On one side, there are enormous crowds, international travel, bright lights, cameras, and constant schedules. On the other side, there are quiet hotel rooms, tired bodies, missed family gatherings, and very little time to simply relax. That is why a gesture from family can become especially meaningful during such periods. A homemade meal does not require a grand speech. It does not need to be photographed or announced to the world. It simply says, "You have been working hard, so take a moment to eat." If Jimin's father really did make such an effort, then the emotional value of the gesture would come from its simplicity. It would be a reminder that even when the entire world is watching Jimin, there are still people who care about him simply because he is their son and family member. If footage of this moment ever appeared publicly and could be verified, fans would probably pay attention to the smallest details. They might notice Jimin's expression when he first sees his father. They might notice whether Jungkook immediately thanks him for the food. They might focus on the way the containers are opened, the atmosphere inside the room, or the conversation happening around the table. But what would likely make the moment memorable is not a dramatic action. It would be the contrast between the enormous world outside and the quiet human moment happening inside. Outside the room, thousands of fans might be waiting for the next performance. Inside, Jimin and Jungkook could simply be eating and talking with someone who had brought them food from home. That contrast is exactly what gives the story its emotional power. Eventually, however, the quiet moment would have to end. The staff would return, preparations would continue, music would begin playing, and the familiar sound of thousands of fans would once again fill the venue. Jimin and Jungkook would have to leave the comfort of the room and return to their roles as performers. Yet if the story is true, they would have carried something with them that no stage production could create. The feeling of being cared for. The food would have provided energy for the next performance, but the gesture behind it may have provided something even more valuable. It would have reminded them that behind every concert, every flight, every rehearsal, and every demanding schedule, there are people waiting for them and thinking about their well-being. In that sense, the meal from Busan would become a quiet source of strength before they stepped back under the lights. And that brings us back to the question that makes this entire story so intriguing. What was actually inside those containers? Was there a particular dish that held a special memory for Jimin? Was it something his father had prepared many times before? Did Jungkook recognize any of the dishes immediately? Or was the emotional reaction simply because the meal represented home at a moment when both of them needed comfort? Without reliable evidence showing the actual event and menu, we should not treat these details as confirmed. But as a narrative, the question remains fascinating because food often carries memories that words cannot fully explain. One familiar aroma can transport someone back years, and one homemade dish can remind a person of the people who were there long before the world knew their name. In the end, the most beautiful part of this story is not whether the meal contains soup, meat, rice, or a special family recipe. It is the idea that even two global superstars can still find comfort in something incredibly ordinary. Jimin and Jungkook may stand in front of tens of thousands of armies, travel across countries, and live under a level of attention most people can hardly imagine. Yet after the lights disappear and the music stops, something as simple as a home-cooked meal can still make the world feel smaller and warmer. If the story of Jimin's father bringing food from Busan is true, then perhaps the greatest gift was never the food itself. It was the time, effort, and love behind every dish. And maybe that is why the image is so powerful. For a few quiet moments before returning to the stage, Jimin and Jungkook were not global superstars. They were simply two tired young men sitting together, sharing a taste of home.